Okay, then hit me then.
Okay, so
I
we
got
aren't going
some
to.
stuff here on Ted Turner that I think it's good stuff.
Well,
So
good. We're going to
let's dump this and go on to.
hold on to that for the next time. I've got one more
Yeah.
Vietnam.
Okay. Let me go on here. Okay. I've got something that I can talk about meeting him concisely and says a lot. Okay. I'll read it when you're ready.
Okay, about Ted. Okay.
No, about Ted Turner, right?
let-
Yeah, about CNN. Why did I go?
Before we go to CNN and why did you go, which is an important bridge to the next aspect of your career, Peter, can you just reflect for a moment on how Vietnam changed the reporting of wars that came thereafter?
One of the great ironies is that the reporting of the Vietnam War was basically resulted in the U.S. military cutting off 90% of future war reporting. And it's been lamentable that in today's conflict environment, in Iraq, in Iraq certainly, and the Iraq War is over, but in Afghanistan, this requirement for embedding and the restrictions in that 9-page document that you need to sign about where you can't take any pictures of American casualties at all. You can't even take pictures of civilian casualties involved in an environment of the war. You cannot interview anyone without an officer being present. You can't just casually chat with any soldier and use it without being cleared. If you use it and it's negative, you've got a problem. Your embedding license is at stake. And this has led to increasing disinterest by media in covering American operations, because the investment of sending a reporter overseas to cover a conflict where Americans are involved is very, very expensive. But you cannot get from those reporters the kind of stories that make the cost worthwhile. I mean, we're in a capitalist world. So Vietnam was not a luxury. The AP spent a lot of money, but getting the kind of stories that the public, that was so persuasive and dramatic, they had to be in newspapers. There's no way today that a journalist can go to Afghanistan to get anything from any military operation that will be overriding persuasiveness. That means that the media are not even really bothering to cover a lot of this stuff. It's fading away. Now, what will happen if there's another big war? Well, first of all, I hope there'll never be another big war. But I'm afraid in another big war, there'll be similar controls. Oh, I talked about this with Walter Cronkite years ago, and he was explaining that while in World War II there was serious censorship, and you were very limited in what you were right, there was no restriction on where a reporter could go. He flew into Normandy in a plane and a drone that landed, and he climbed out with soldiers behind enemy lines. Others went ashore on the beaches of Normandy. They were there. Now they were restricted in what they could write, but the thing is, they were there. And Cronkite said he attended background briefings with Eisenhower. The thing was, he said, I came out of that war knowing what had gone on, and that affected what I said about that war and what I talked about the war or what I wrote about that war for the rest of my career. And the same that every journalist who was in World War II came out with vast knowledge of the inside story. How many journalists come out of these war-torn areas today? Do you know where the story comes from today? like the bin Laden raid in which bin Laden was captured and killed. What really happened? You waited a year and a half for the participants to write their own books, the big advances. So eventually you found out about what happened a year and a half later. And that could be you repeat that in books on Afghanistan and other stuff. So the military, I don't think, they don't mind those books because the military involved, they don't want public opinion to zero in on current policy. If you write a book later, that's okay, but yet currently they're trying to control the political influence of reality on the public or on the lawmakers. We wrote about the reality of Vietnam, and the government tried to pretend a scenario that didn't exist, and that ultimately our reality paid off in public and congressional and, in fact, newspaper resistance to the blandishments of Washington and turning against the war. Today, you have commentators complaining about Afghanistan and Yemen and others, but you don't have media that want to send reporters there because you're not going to get anything. This is a tragedy. And I think that the militaries are using Vietnam coverage as an excuse not to allow reporters anywhere anymore. And I don't think that is fair. I think in the aftermath, we know the record of all the reporters. We know what they did, how many turncoats were amongst the press corps, analyze all the reporting has been done by experts. We did as good a job as we could do, and we have nothing to apologize for. But the military used the criticism that evolved within the military to black out reporters completely. Now, I think the pity is that American families who have soldiers overseas don't have a damn clue about what's going on, other than the messages they get from their sons or husbands, which are controlled by the military also. They don't understand, and the American public doesn't have much sympathy. Overall, the American public will applaud the sacrifice that soldiers are making, say, in Afghanistan today, sort of like, gee, what a great thing they're doing. They don't have any idea of what that entails, or they don't have any idea of what they should think about it other than saying, these are patriotic boys. In Vietnam, they were saying, these guys are dying for a stupid cause. The public is in no position really to make a definitive argument about whether it's a good idea or not, and there's so much else going on, they don't have to worry about it. I think that the system is failing in terms of coverage of international events. Now, Washington, hey, classic reporting. Afghanistan and Yemen, no, and I don't blame any news organization for the paying or risking the life of reporters in those locales because of the incredible restrictions that continue on them.
Peter, after you left Vietnam, up until Vietnam and thereafter for a bit, your entire career had been in print journalism. But in 1981, I believe, you came to a fledgling cable news outlet called CNN. Could you talk to us about how you came to CNN, what a print reporter like you was doing, putting his voice as well as his face on television, and how that was different from what you had done?
Pure luck. I'll tell you how it happened, literally. I was in Atlanta, Georgia, for a second long visit to do a second series on the phenomenon of the missing and murdered children in Atlanta, where there were 29 young children. Their bodies were found floating in the Chattahoochee River over a period of 2 months. And I was down there doing a second series for the AP, a huge story. And while waiting to interview a prominent black leader who was staying at a motel And I was there at just at dawn, really, because he traveled around a lot. And emerging from the mist was Richard Bleister, who had been a colleague of mine in Vietnam and in New York and a pal. And I'd heard that he had joined this tin-pot cable operation and was in the London bureau, maybe in the London bureau chief. And he walked across the road. We embraced and we laughed at each other, and he said, "Are you still with old Granny AP?" And I'm with the CNN. I said, it's what is it? I'd never heard of CNN. Literally, I'd heard of Ted Turner. Where do you see it? And he said, "Look, you got to come along with me when you get a chance, maybe tomorrow, and visit our headquarters. It's an old Jewish, an old Jewish clubhouse, but it's a beautiful big building, and we operate out of there, and you'll like it. I want you to visit it." I said, "Why do I want to visit?" "Well, I'm lonely in the business. I want company. All these young people are there. I don't know." And it's literally talking. So I was late for that appointment, but I went the next day, and the first thing that Bert Reinhardt, who was the acting president at that point, the president the president was away. So I go in, and Reinhardt says, "Well, you want a job here? Peter Arnett wants to work here?" And because I was sort of well known in the media environment, and I said, "No, Blystone invited me to come along and just to meet, and I just want to walk around the newsroom and see all the anchor ladies getting made up." And I said, "It's fascinating. It's like a movie to me." He said, "Well, while you're here, so what I want you to do is have a little screen test." And I said, "Well," he said, "do it." He said, "Now go next door and just don't look at the camera. Look at my assistant, who was a former CBS producer, forget his name. Look at him and tell him a story for 2 minutes, and then bring the tape back and we'll play it on the television." So I went next door, and I'm sitting there, and the CBS producer says, "Now, look in the camera. Talk into the camera. That's how anchors do it. Don't look at me." Look, so I did the 2-minute spiel going, and so Reinhardt puts it in the "What the hell are you looking into the camera for? I told you to look at this guy." And he's in the corner, so I thought, I got to get out of here. I got to get out of here. These guys are crazy. But he did show me around the shop, and I left, and I said goodbye to Blystone and all my intention. Well, I didn't have any intention. I didn't have any idea that I wanted to do it. And I'd been talking to, I was sort of sick of the AP, and I'd been talking to Eddie Adams about a few other ventures and stuff. But I was ready to leave the AP and to fly away somewhere, but I wasn't really sure. I didn't have a clue until 2 nights later. I get a call in New York from Reese Schonfeld, who was the president. Great guy, very little smart, liberal character, and he said, Peter, you got to join us. You got to join us. I mean, you're the greatest. You got to join us." And I said, "Well, you're kidding, aren't you?" He says, "No, we got a slot open." And they'd hired a CBS guy to be national correspondent, but he had pulled out. He said, "We've got financing for that slot, and I want you in there, national correspondent for CNN." I said, "I'm a special international correspondent for the AP. I can go anywhere in the world." And he said, "You can go anywhere in the world with us." And I thought, hey, because at that point in my career with the AP, that I'd done so much war reporting that the management was, I don't know, they were looking for new blood, or maybe they were sick of my writing, maybe I was difficult to live with. But whatever it was, I had the sense that new management was sort of, I may have been wrong, but with Schonfeld. So I flew down to Atlanta and met him. and signed up on the spot. He gave me a 10% increase in my I was being paid pretty well by the AP, but he gave me a 10% increase, and I started with CNN 3 weeks later. Now, I got a funny story here because Lou Bacardi, who was the managing director at that time, or executive director, he had been offered a job, and I think with a paper out west, to be the editor or a publisher or some big job, and he was struggling with his decision whether or not to leave the AP. So I went to say goodbye to Fuller, and he says, "Well, you know how to talk. You'll be okay on television, I guess." But I never got along with Fuller. He didn't trust me. Texan, right? Patriotism, all that stuff. Maybe, I don't know. But he later in my life was a factor, but that's by the way. But anyway, I went to give my letter to Bacardi. He says, "Peter, resignation, official letter." He says, "Thanks, but I'm really busy. I got to go and make a phone call," because he is rushing off to make his own decision about leaving. But later, Lou sent me a beautiful letter, sort of saying, "Well, look, it's sorry to see you go." I went to Atlanta, and my first, ironically, when I got there, they had arrested a suspect in the missing and murdered children case. So I flew down, and I was on the air for 3 or 4 hours a day talking about it. And don't forget, in those days, CNN had plenty of time to 24-hour-a-day thing. So, and I settled into it, and actually my career very quickly, they were sending me to Central America and elsewhere overseas, and I was doing more travel with CNN than I'd ever done with the AP. And but it was tough travel because they had usually inexperienced crews. They didn't have much money to spare, so they didn't have network quality technicians or camera people, nor did they have correspondents that were network quality, including Peter Arnett. But it was a labor of love, mainly because of Ted Turner, and I want you to read this. This is what notes I wrote about Ted. "I met Ted Turner soon after I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, as the network's national correspondent. CNN's headquarters was housed in an ornate 2-story building that had formerly been a Jewish men's club. Several huge circular antennas dominated the well-kept grounds, aimed at broadcasting news content around the world. While sitting on the back lawn eating a lunch sandwich with colleagues one day, we were joined by Ted Turner, who sat in the grass beside us. He had just returned from the Soviet Union, he said, where officials had agreed to join a weekend discussion panel broadcast live from Moscow and Washington, D.C. Ted said he was on his way to Havana on a second visit to meet Fidel Castro, who turned out to be a baseball fan who was delighted with Turner's initiative in sending live broadcasts to Cuba of Turner's Braves basketball games. It was the team that he controlled. I asked Ted his ambitions for CNN. Quote, he said, "We'll be an echo chamber for the world, to tell not only the American story, but also the story of all other countries. I want news bureaus all over the world. To hell with the political barriers. We'll just leap over them." He grinned, and then he said to me, "Peter, you know how to do that stuff, the journalism, the reporting. I'm the money guy, the technical guy. I'll be behind you, and behind all the others we are hiring." I believed him. And I believed what at the time seemed to be this crazy vision that he had. And for the next 17 years, I was with CNN. He was the friendly, supportive presence in my journalistic life. Ted Turner. I'm still sort of in touch with him as the years go by.
Talk about the difference in producing a television story Contrast it with what you had been doing in print for so many years. What was the process?
Big differences, of course. You're immediately noticeable when you arrive with your crew to any new scene. There's at least, in those days, at least 3 of you, because the audio equipment was very heavy that had to be carried. And you had big cameras that CNN had. They sort of had outdated equipment. So you needed a husky cameraman. You needed someone who could carry the audio equipment, and you needed the reporter, and you'd have to the reporter would carry the sticks, the props for the camera. And if you were lucky, you'd have a producer that would come along and help you sort of organize these coverage. But you're immediately noticeable. As a print reporter, you can drift around, you can just sort of quietly edge in and out of. That's how, as a print reporter, I did my coverage of international stories. I was always pretend to be something other than a reporter, and drifting around and being Mr. Sociable and whatever you had to do, all being aggressive when I had to, but always sort of not particularly noticeable. And but with the television, you've got that big object that attracts everyone's attention. And in the kind of world, the world that was developing in the 80s, a camera meant television, movies, visibility. So the benefit of that is everyone we met wanted to be on television, whether it's Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, Radko Mladic, Yasser Arafat. They all wanted to be on camera, and they all wanted to be on CNN camera after the Gulf War. Before the Gulf War, I found that whereas with the AP, I'd spent time in the Caribbean a lot in South America, it was always a hassle to get an interview with one of these officials, the president. I'd always do it, but it'd be a hassle. They'd say, we're busy, and and I'd have to write letters, and you got a camera. They're all available. I interviewed the whole lot, all the presidents of Central America without any problem at all. They were willing to sit down and take questions without any, the rebel leaders, the government leaders, and particularly with CNN, because CNN by the mid-'80s was seen all over Central America and Latin America in particular, and because it was an easy signal to move. And a lot of these people, of course, out of relatives in Miami, they're coming in and out of the U.S. CNN became super important in Central America before any other foreign country. And we could access literally for anyone. The negative side is that when you were going into the areas where there was rebel activity, you're very obvious. So as you're going as a print journalist, you can sort of slink around or sit in a car, and your driver can pretend to be someone else, or, a relative or whatever. But with the camera, but I think the benefits outweighed the negatives. Now, in telling the story, CNN was unique because unlike the networks, which would have a little space on the evening news, the only space at that point in time for news was the evening news. A minute 40, 2 minutes, a minute 20, and they were happy to get that. CNN wanted at least one story every day, maybe 2 stories a day from me. They preferred that the stories be 3 or 4 minutes long, but if it was a good story, you could do a 6-minute story, and they'd run it. And so I just kept producing wherever I was. And particularly in Central America, it was so beautiful. And so the people were so wonderful down there, and it was so violent. At times we'd leave the hotel in Salvador, and the not the insurgents, but the hit squads, the government murder squads, would leave sort of bodies out in front of the hotel. And I remember one crew coming back, and they went to a neighboring city, and there were heads along the center point of the road going into town, sort of warning, stay away. not just to us, but to anyone. So and in fact, some journalists were killed by getting too close. But the thing was, though, that the visuals were so wonderful that I had such great fun and pleasure in using my own AP skills in writing narrative, stories, because in the AP I could write a good story in 400 or 500 words, no problem. I could also do 3,000 words. But the average news script was about, 500 words, 600. And suddenly I had these wonderful pictures in which I could write a script to them, and it was a thrill. I'd just sit down and I'd be looking at the video, and then I'd sit down and do it, and it was with great pleasure. Now, in Central America and in most places in those days, the networks would hire satellite time from the local publisher. We shipped most everything. So not only did we do the story, I or someone would drive to the airport, whatever country we were in, and ship it back to Miami, mainly because all the planes went to Miami, and our bureau there would put it on air. So there was that that delay. But the delay didn't mean anything because the networks weren't even trying to compete in the sense that the material that we would reveal. I mean, we just have these long pieces on the political system, and I think that we did a pretty good job in dramatizing it. We had good editors, and we'd sort of make these dramatic, and we had access to all the players. So we'd have the guys on air, and we could talk about them, and then then you had the interchange. It was just a smorgasbord of creativity.
I want to drill down to the actual process. You're talking about teamwork to put a story together. How would the reporter, who presumably you write a script, work with the editor who's cutting the pictures?
So I want to read you a quick story that I think it'll explain a bit of that, okay?
Sure.
Now, this is a story that I wrote on September 25, 1983 in Central America. And I'll just read it as I'll read it as I say it. Okay. So let me get it sorted out. Just bear with me a second. Bear with me a second. I've got the pages sort of screwed up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, hang on a minute. Okay, well, I'll narrate it. I'll read a little and, okay.
No dry skin.
Okay. So basically, I'll tell you what it is. The story is about a little town called Tenancingo, which sat in the middle part of El Salvador, and it was several miles off the main Pan-American highway. And it was a small militia outpost, a militia that was associated with attached to a infantry division, which was in a larger town. So there were soldiers there, and there was a big outpost. I didn't know any of that. I'd never heard of Tenancingo, but this was a Sunday, September 25, 1983. And there was a fairly big press corps in Salvador then. It was a big story, Central America. And then Sunday was a day everyone went to play. But I needed some B-roll for an analysis I did, and I told the crew we're going to go out on the road. And they says, "Oh, Peter, no." I said, "We're going to go out, guys." "Yeah, as long as we're back in time to party." I don't blame them, because we drove out. And as we were driving 40 minutes or so, and we could see smoke on the horizon, we stopped the car, and there was boom, boom, boom. Now, Salvador was a place where you didn't hear much bombing. You didn't see, it was sort of a close quarter war, small arms, and then boom, boom, boom. So we drove along. We had a very good driver, Romeo. He says, "Oh, that's probably at Tenancingo, And I said, "What do you mean Tenancingo?" "Well, it's a small community up the road. The road to it is where we're approaching it." We got there. There's a roadblock. in military. So Romeo goes out and he's talking to the soldiers. And they tell him, well, you know, this Tenancingo, it was a military outpost overrun by the insurgent, let me say that again. It's a small town. It's an outpost of military. It was overrun by the left-wing insurgents, and we're fighting to get it back. We've got units going in there. And I said, you got units going in there, and there's bombing? I said, we want to go through. Get them to take us through. And they said, they said, no, but if you want to walk, they said, we don't care. So there was the driver and the sound man and the cameraman and then my producer, girl in Yonts, who also happened to be my girlfriend at the time, and me, and we start walking in 5 miles. So about a mile in, there's these dozens of people walking out, women and children carrying possessions and looking very distraught. We went along further. There's several wounded, hobbling out or being carried. And Romeo was talking to them and saying, oh, God, they're blasting the town to pieces. There's bodies all over the city. There's no soldiers anywhere near. They're just using bombs and artillery. So as we get closer, a spotter plane comes over, and Romeo says, you better go, because they're looking down and they're seeing you're carrying this equipment. That's not military equipment. They don't know. They'll call an airstrike on it. So we scattered into the hill. Eventually, we get into the city, and there were bombs falling, you know, around the place. And there's bodies, women and kids, scrawled along this main street. There's people cowering sort of in stores and that, and just hiding. And there are these rebels walking around with AKs and berets, and, you know what I'm saying? Romeo, he says, I said, what are they saying? He says, no one's going to drive us out of here. We had a victory here. We killed all the militia, and to hell with the bombing. And we're staying. So I said, I want these guys on camera. So they were talking about, they were just young, good-looking guys and dressed like that. And so we wander around for an hour or two, and the military then started to approach. And the word came that there were truckloads of troops on the path that we had come. And so the guerrillas said goodbye and faded away. But they left behind a town that had been blown to pieces, and a lot of people dead, and a lot of soldiers dead. I mean, there was a post of about 80 men, so some of them had run, but most of them. So we said, it's time to go. And as it was, a vehicle came in and with some local people who were coming in, and we just got on it and drove out to the road and went into town. So we had this story. And we got to the hotel, and our sound man who'd walked 10 miles and running around all day, Duncan Finch, he was our editor. And I said to Duncan, you know, we got to get this story done. And he said, I know, but it's such a wonderful story, and I just going to take a long time, and I'm so tired. I said, Duncan, we got to get the story. And I said, I'm going to write the script now, and a half an hour from now, I'm going to give you the script. You look through the video and see what you can do. So I wrote a story, and in fact, I was hoping I had the script, but I said, okay, the opening line of my story. Death visited Tenancingo on Sunday. It lingered all day in this remote Salvadoran town, snatching at children and women and men. And this was over bodies, women, kids on the street. That was the opening video. So Duncan worked all night. He was in the room, he had the video, I narrated the script. I went to bed at 11 o'clock, got up at dawn, go into the room, and he's laying the last video on this 8-minute piece. And I had a look at it, and I thought, this is phenomenal. It had all the drama. It had the soldiers coming, and it had the rebels, and the planes that were coming in, not good planes, but shots of planes coming in, helicopter and bombing, and so I took it and I drove down to the international airport in Salvador, about a 40-minute, 30-minute drive, and got it on a TACA Airways flight to Miami. And CNN first aired it at noon that day. That would have been the 25th, because it was a Monday, and ran it a dozen times. My colleagues couldn't believe it. They started getting callbacks because I had told the staff, don't say anything. We didn't get anything today. This is a secret. And those of us, they said, okay. So they started getting callbacks, and they're saying, what the hell is this? The NBC, well, they're going crazy. So we started showing the piece, and the room was crowded. People were coming. It was a great piece. And anyway, I thought the story, as I say, it was the most dramatic I'd done in my short career, TV career. And a critic in the Los Angeles Times Weekly wrote, quote, the footage was so startling that I was astonished it got on the air. Credit to the CNN desk. And I won a journalism prize for the story, my third Sigma Delta Guy Distinguished Service Award, and actually that was the first major award the CNN had won. It was for that story. And what did that take? We walked, an editor walked all night, we sweated it out. I got in a vehicle and drove to the airport, and it was that kind of effort that was replicated all over the CNN landscape. It was only later that when we'd go into Baghdad in the mid-90s with 12 trucks and, a whole truck full of vodka and all the rest, that was then. At this point in time, we had nothing. And I had a quote from Peter Jennings that I wanted to find, but I couldn't. But in 1985, in the major earthquake in Mexico City that killed 25,000 people, major story, well, CNN shared a satellite uplink with Peter Jennings and ABC. And I'd known Jennings for years off, and I wasn't particularly close, but I knew him. And at one point, when he saw us scrambling around, he said, Peter, it reminds me of the early days of ABC. We did exactly the same thing. We didn't have any money. No one said we could go anywhere. And he talked like that, and I said, Peter, you want to switch jobs? But one comment on Peter Jennings, the most admirable, superb television personality, news personality I ever met, and I met them all. But he was doing the evening news each night in Mexico City with just a little script. And he was not only introducing his own stories and the stories of reporter, other stories, and he was just standing there, perfect. And not only that, a gentleman and a very, very smart guy. And I looked at this man, and he was, 6'2", handsome, the son of one of Canada's most important broadcasters. And I thought, I'm not going to make it. However, 6 years later, I was interviewed with Peter Jennings at the 92nd Street Y. We sat there and talked about coverage. So, for a moment, I had parody.
Peter, you mentioned the Gulf War. 1990, 1991, something of an inflection point for CNN and for television news generally. You and your colleagues covered the beginning of that war live. Take us into Baghdad and Iraq in 1990 and 1991. Tell us what your role was and how you were able to do what you did.
You really want to hear that story? Yes. So can I have a bathroom break?
Yes.
Quickly? Okay.
Yes.